Good evening, everybody. So excited to welcome you all to the Junior League of Denver's Wine and Ballots this evening. My name is Allie Coleman-Wagner, and I'm a member of the Training and Outreach Committee on the Public Policy Council. We're really looking forward to sharing with you this evening a training on a deep dive of the ballot measures with impartial analyses to help our members and friends understand the purpose and effect of each of these measures prior to voting. So this training will contain this nonpartisan overview, help you understand how various ballot measures will impact you, your community, and the state of Colorado. Then we'll have a deeper dive panel discussion on a few key ballot measures that align to issues closest to the league's focus. Our emphasis this evening will be on this high-level overview, followed by some time diving more deeply into Proposition II and Proposition HH. We'll spend some time on Denver Question 2P, and then close out with a brief highlight of the Denver Metro ballot measures. So things that are going on in Denver and the surrounding counties. So before we begin our training, I'm just going to give our guests a brief overview of the Junior League of Denver. So the Junior League of Denver is an organization of women committed to promoting volunteerism, developing the potential of women, and improving communities through the effective action and leadership of trained volunteers. Its purpose is exclusively educational and charitable. The focus of the Junior League of Denver is to disrupt the cycle of systemic poverty for women and families in Denver. Our goal is to amplify advocacy efforts to engage more members and create lasting community change. And a little bit more about the Junior League of Denver Public Policy Council. The Public Policy Council works to influence and shape policy at the state legislature, focusing on policies that impact our mission, our members, and community partners. We are actually one of the few leagues in the country to have a Public Policy Council. We also provide training opportunities and empower our members to engage as advocates in their communities. We've designed this training for you to understand the purpose and effect of each measure prior to voting. And as a reminder, once again, we're going to keep our focus this evening completely and strictly nonpartisan. And it's on here once again. So I'll emphasize it once again. We are, in fact, a nonpartisan organization and council. And we ask that the questions that you post into the chat reflect that. That said, we ask that you do post those questions in the chat. We'll be using those to guide the discussion after each overview. The other thing that I want to remind you of is to use that wine discount. We have partnered with Blanchard Family Wines for a 20% discount on bottles and a 30% discount on orders of 6 or more bottles. You can order those by directly emailing james@blanchardfamilywines.com. And so we look forward to you all taking advantage of that as you learn more about our public policy efforts and opportunities in Colorado. Any questions before we get rolling? All right. In that case, I would love to introduce our presenters for this evening. Tonight, we're going to hear presentations from Greg Sabetsky from the Colorado Legislative Council about Propositions II and HH. Elsa Holguin from the Denver Preschool Program about Denver Question 2P. And Julia Scanlon from Aponte and Busam for an overview of the remaining Denver local ballot initiatives. Go Julia and Dean. We're excited to have start off our evening though with a discussion of Prop II and Prop HH with Greg Sabetsky. Greg is the chief economist at Legislative Council staff, the nonpartisan research staff of the Colorado General Assembly. He leads a team of economists and social scientists who forecast Colorado's economy and tax revenue, equipping members of the General Assembly to maintain a balanced state budget. Since joining Legislative Council staff in 2013, Greg has developed a reputation as an expert in state income taxes, property tax, transportation finance, and the Colorado Constitution's Taxpayer Bill of Rights, or TABOR amendment. He is also a regular co-author of the nonpartisan Blue Book voter guide that's mailed to households before the election. You've probably received one of those already. Greg is a Colorado native and University of Denver graduate. So with that, thank you for joining us today, Greg, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Allie, and thanks to everyone for being with us here this evening. I'm going to pull up my slides, and you should see them now, which is great. So I've got about an hour of your time on the agenda this evening, and I want to make sure that it's as valuable to you all as voters as it can be. The way that we'll do this is I'm going to begin presenting Proposition II. The reason for that is because I think it is simpler than Prop HH. We'll then take questions on Prop II, and at some point I'll move us along so that we have plenty of time to discuss Proposition HH. These are the only two statewide measures on the ballot this year. It's an odd year election. That means that the only measures that can be on the ballot are measures that arise because they require voter approval under the Tabor Amendment. And we'll talk about the context that that has for both II and HH. But that means that you get to spend time with me, the chief economist, instead of talking about more direct impacts on individuals. We have to think about the economic impacts, the tax impacts, and that's what I'll be presenting for you all this evening. So again, I'm going backwards here. I'm starting with II. This appears on your ballot after HH. It also looks like it says Proposition 2 or Proposition LL, but it in fact is II. And we've captioned it in the Blue Book, retain nicotine tax revenue in excess of Blue Book estimate. I'll give you a clear picture of what that means here in a moment. This is the question that you will see on the ballot itself. It's a long question, and I'm not going to read the whole question to you this evening because I'm going to dig into what it means, I think, in a bit more digestible detail. But that's the question so that you can familiarize yourself with what it'll look like on your ballot. So Proposition II arises because of a requirement in Tabor, and that specifically isn't the part of Tabor that you're probably most familiar with. I know that many of you were able to hear from my colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Ramey, who provided an overview of Tabor to many of you earlier this month. Tabor has a few different components. One is the voter approval for new taxes component, which is actually implicated here. We'll get into that. One is the Tabor limit component, which we'll talk about in the context of Prop HH. But the more sort of niche component of Tabor that's relevant here is Tabor subsection 3. And what this does is it provides requirements for what voters need to see when they look at the ballot for a tax measure. So back in 2020, the state put a measure on the ballot to increase cigarette tobacco and impose a new tax on nicotine products. So it was a cigarette tax increase, tobacco tax increase, and a new tax on nicotine, vape products, e-cigarettes, whatever you'd like to call that. Because that was a new tax, we needed to comply with the Tabor requirement that says we need to provide for the first full fiscal year of each proposed district tax increase, district estimates of the maximum dollar amount of each increase and of district fiscal year spending without the increase. Now that reads like legalese, and it is, that's a portion of the Constitution, but essentially what Tabor 3 tells us is when there's a new tax on the ballot, we need to tell voters how much they should expect the state, in this case, we're the district that's in question, to collect in the first year when the tax applies. So if you read your Blue Book back in 2020, this is what you would have seen for Proposition EE, that tobacco tax measure. We said, well, here's our estimate of fiscal year spending without the tax increase, and here's our estimate of revenue from the tax increase, $186.5 million. What we actually collected in that fiscal year 2021-22 was $208 million. So that's $21.5 million above the estimate. And I wanted to give you a little bit of context for why we collected revenue over that estimate. Again, this is an increase in cigarette taxes, an increase in tobacco taxes, and a new tax on nicotine products. Our cigarette estimate was a little bit below what we actually collected. Excuse me, our estimate was a little bit above what we actually collected. The revenue was a little bit below our estimate. The other tobacco products, cigars, chewing tobacco, etc., came in right as we estimated. But the nicotine component came in above our estimate pretty significantly. And that's what drove the difference of $21.5 million in total revenue relative to our estimate. So how did we get it wrong? Well, the first point is whenever we're making a prediction as economists, we're targeting a dollar amount, and we know that there's a possibility that our estimate may be too low or maybe too high. In this case, drilling down to the nicotine estimate in particular, we didn't have any state level data at the time on how much nicotine products were being sold in Colorado, because before Proposition EE, those products weren't taxed. And so they were just sales that were occurring in a store. They were subject to sales tax. They weren't subject to any specific tax that would have entailed any specific reporting on the amount of those transactions. What we had access to was some data from Nielsen that talked about retail transactions for tobacco and nicotine products at convenience stores and at grocery stores. We also had some tax collections data from states that had enacted taxes before Colorado did on this product. So at the time that Colorado passed Proposition EE, 9 states already had taxes in effect, but most of those states had just enacted their taxes. Remember, vaping, e-cigarettes, these are new products that emerged during the 2010s, and we didn't have a long history when states had actually created their new tax regimes. There's 3 states that we had data for, where they had had taxes in places for long enough and actually could tell us, here's how much we've generated from this revenue stream. But 2 of those states, Louisiana and North Carolina, they imposed taxes on this product very differently than Proposition EE would have, and we knew that their revenue collections wouldn't be especially helpful in terms of helping us to build an estimate. So we had this Nielsen data, and we had tax collections data from a 3rd state, Minnesota, and we knew that Colorado's taxes were going to look really similar to Minnesota's taxes. But it turned out that even with these data, our estimate ended up being too low for the amount of those new tax collections. There are some reasons why that may have happened. I think we had data deficiencies in both of these sources. The Nielsen data that we had, we knew were not comprehensive. They weren't capturing all of the sales in the Colorado market. The second thing that we learned later is Minnesota reports the amount of e-cigarette taxes that they collect, but they do this by collecting one tax on both cigarettes, tobacco, and nicotine products, and then their analysts try and segment that revenue according to what it comes from. And so if they segmented that revenue incorrectly and underreported the amount of nicotine tax collections, that could have been a source of error in our estimate. Most importantly, I think this is a new product in a new market. It was still evolving at the time that these 2020 estimates were made, and we didn't know exactly how market conditions were going to behave over time. And in particular, one really big distortion was the pandemic. Obviously, 2020, when we passed Prop EE, was during the pandemic, but we didn't know about changes in e-cigarette consumption habits that were going on when everyone was stuck at home and unable to go out and do other things in the economy. So we've learned a lot about how people consumed different products during the pandemic. We know alcohol consumption went way up. We know in particular marijuana consumption went way up. And it looks like e-cigarette consumption or vaping consumption may have also gone way up during that time period. So bottom line, our estimate was too low, and there's a downstream TABOR requirement that triggers. So I told you before about TABOR section 3B3, sorry, that's this one that we read earlier. And now the next paragraph in TABOR is this TABOR 3C. It says, except by later approval, if a tax increase or fiscal year spending estimate exceeds the estimate in B3, the tax increase is thereafter reduced up to 100% in proportion to the combined dollar excess and the combined excess revenue refunded. So 2 requirements here. Because we exceeded the estimate, we need to reduce the tax increase and we need to refund the excess revenue, except in a case where we obtain later voter approval. And that brings us to Proposition II. So first of all is the refund obligation. I told you before that we collected $21.5 million over our estimate that we had put in the Blue Book, and there's an attendant interest obligation of about $2.15 million. That means that if Proposition II does not pass, the state is required to refund $23.65 million. So again, if Prop II fails, we would refund that to the taxpayers. In this case, those taxpayers are wholesalers and distributors. This is not a retail sales tax. If you go and buy a pack of cigarettes or if you go and buy a vape pen, the taxes that you're paying on that product already, the amount that you're paying in the purchase price for that product already includes the tax that that distributor, the convenience store, the grocery store, the smoker-friendly, whomever you're going to buy that product from, they've already paid that tax to the state at the point when they acquired that product. So the refunds would go back to those wholesalers and distributors, the taxpayers in this instance. Now, the part of Prop EE that we haven't talked about is that this was a measure that was designed to fund preschool programs. And so all of these marginal dollars, anything that we do not refund if Prop II fails, gets retained and is required by the state to be spent for preschool programs. These are the tax rates that voters approved in Proposition EE. You can see that there are increases that first took effect when Prop EE took effect back in 2021. Those initial tax rates run through June of next year. And then in July of next year, the tax rates will go up further. And in July of 2027, they'll even go up more. If Prop II fails, because we need to reduce those tax rates in proportion to the dollar excess, it is an 11.53% reduction in those tax rates. So to wrap up on Prop II before I move on to Prop HH, if you vote for Prop II, you are maintaining the tax rates that voters already approved when they passed Proposition EE, and you're ensuring that that money can be used as voters intended. And specifically, voters, when they passed Proposition EE, intended for the money that's collected from these taxes to be used to provide free preschool. In this case, this is money that the state has indicated that it would expect and intend to spend for preschool programs that target high-need families. We expect that this would improve educational outcomes and support working parents. On the flip side, the Blue Book also identifies arguments against Proposition II. One is that when voters approved Proposition EE, they expected a certain amount of funding to be generated for preschool programs. And we have that money, right? Prop EE expected that we'd collect $185 million. We're collecting that revenue, and even if Prop II fails, that revenue will be available to be spent for preschool programs. So this is an additional expansion of those programs beyond what voters approved in Prop EE. And because the tax rates would need to go down if Prop II fails, Prop II effectively raises those taxes. And those are taxes that target products that are overwhelmingly purchased by people who are addicted to cigarettes or addicted to vaping. Those tend to be lower income folks who have less money to spend elsewhere in the economy. I think that wraps up everything that I had wanted to discuss on Prop II. I'll pause here to answer any questions on II before I go on to HH. And then if there are any outstanding questions on II that come up later in the presentation, I'm happy to take those at the end of my talk. Looking in the chat, I don't see any questions on II. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to talk about Prop HH unless anyone from the Junior League wants to stop me here.
It looks like we just got one posed in the chat.
Okay, cool. I see this one from Alicia. She asks, if II fails, the money will go back to wholesalers. However, if that tax was already baked into the price, does that mean they just pocket the refund? Or is there any obligation in how the refund is used? It's a good question. In this instance, the tax was paid by the wholesalers and distributors. And so because they're the taxpayer, there's no additional strings attached to how they use that money. They could use it to cut prices for downstream products, or they could pay employees, or they could increase investment in their companies, or they could send it back to their shareholders. The legislation that referred Prop II to voters doesn't specify anything further about that. I guess I should know, I probably ought to have noted this at the top, both of these measures were referred to the ballot by the legislature. These are not initiated measures. These are measures that passed the House and Senate with a majority of the vote and were put on the ballot by the Colorado General Assembly. Okay.
We had one additional.
One more from Katie here. It says, so to understand correctly, the money would not go back to the individual taxpayers. I think that I can answer that question, but I want to be really clear about what it's asking. The money does go back to the folks who paid these taxes. It's just that the folks who paid these taxes legally are these businesses, the wholesalers and distributors. The state, when it imposes the tax, says that the businesses are responsible for the tax. It's not like a sales tax where the tax is actually imposed on the purchaser of the product. There's no requirement that the money goes back to the folks who bought the vape pens or who bought the cigarettes. It's only a requirement that the money goes back to the people who paid the taxes on those products, which were the wholesalers and distributors in this case. Looks like one more from Abby. Is there any money for public service notices or campaigns to explain who the money would be refunded to? No, I don't think so. When the state refers these ballot measures, it doesn't ever fund a campaign around getting the ballot measure to pass. I think in general, the measure gets put on the ballot, and then maybe some of those same representatives and senators go out to the public to campaign in favor of the measure, or if they voted against the measure, maybe they go out to campaign against the measure. But there's no additional state funding for educating voters about who the refunds would go to if Prop II passes or fails.
We had a couple questions come up from folks in the room too that I wanted to pose to you, if that's all right.
Oh, of course.
Hey, somebody had asked, what is the average amount of money that the wholesaler would be getting back?
That's a good question. It's going to depend, I think, on how much the wholesaler paid in. So the legislation that referred Prop II is pretty vague about how the refunds need to be made. It gives a lot of deference to the Department of Revenue, which is the state agency that would be paying back these refunds. And the Department of Revenue hasn't published any documents that says, here's how we'd give the money back. In this case, though, the department does have a clear record of who paid the taxes. And I think one likely outcome is that the refunds would be proportional. So if you're a taxpayer who accounted for 8% of these collections, it may be the case that you'd get 8% of that $23.5 million back. But we don't know that for a fact because the legislation that referred Prop II doesn't actually tell us that.
Okay, and then the only other question that I'd seen posed up, and other than I saw one, Kylie just posted something in the chat just now, but just noting that there was a request for slides after the presentation, if this is something that you're willing to share.
Absolutely. I see one question from Kylie in the chat, and this one's a great one. She raises the point that, hey, the argument against talks about how Prop II raises taxes on people who are low income or people who are addicts, but just a second ago, you told me, hey, aren't the actual payers of this tax the wholesalers and distributors? That's a great point, and I think that there is a little bit of a dissonance there. We know that the wholesalers and distributors are going to pass those taxes through to the retailers, and that the retailers are going to pass those taxes through to individuals. One of the arguments for Proposition EE when it was on the ballot back in 2020 was some groups that promote public health would argue, hey, higher taxes on cigarettes are actually great because they dissuade people from purchasing so many cigarettes and giving themselves cancer. And so in that instance too, the cigarette tax isn't a tax that's paid at retail. It's a tax where we know that if we impose a higher tax rate at wholesale, that those taxes will be passed through. But because the tax is imposed at wholesale, and because Tabor requires that we refund the money to the people who paid the taxes, we're not able to go back or at least Prop II doesn't attempt to go back and give this money back to each of the individual folks who purchase the products at retail. But I think that there's an implicit critique there that is well-founded about a little bit of an inconsistency in the way that I've presented this. Okay, Ali, anything else in the room?
No, but another person has just added something to the chat.
Okay, yeah, so a few questions here, and I'm going to take, I see one from Dana, one from Tori, and one from Stephanie. I'm going to answer all of these, but then I want to move on to HH just because it's a more complicated measure and I want to make sure we have plenty of time for it. So Dana asked, is this something we would vote on again, or does this become permanent and the state keeps all funds from these taxes in the future if it passes? Great question. So Tabor only cares about the first year. We had to provide an estimate for the first year. We exceeded the estimate in the first year. Now we either need to make a refund and lower the tax rates, or we need to get voter approval to keep that excess. So after this, we're done with the Prop EE saga. For some history, the same sort of thing happened with marijuana taxes. In that case, it wasn't the estimate of the new tax revenue. It was actually this other estimate that we had to provide, the one on the first line that says fiscal year spending without the tax increase. And so in 2013, we referred Prop AA, which was marijuana taxes. And in 2015, we came back and referred a measure, Prop BB, that was, hey, can the state keep all of these marijuana taxes even though we exceeded this estimate? So good question, but in this case, we'd be done. Tori asked, can we please go back to the question on the ballot? Yes, we can. This is the question on the ballot. If you vote yes on this question, you are voting for Prop II. You are voting for the state to keep the money, and you're voting for that money to go to preschools. If you vote no on Prop II, you are voting to require the refunds to the wholesalers and distributors and for the proportional reductions in the tax rates. And then Stephanie asked, could the difference go back to the tobacco companies? I think it goes back to the wholesalers and distributors. So these are not necessarily the manufacturers, but they are the importers or the companies that bring the product into Colorado. Okay. Ali, is it all right if I move on to HH?
Yeah, it makes sense to hop.
Great. Okay. I will tell you that I think that was a pretty complete discussion of Prop II. I am going to provide as close to a complete discussion of Prop HH as I can this evening, with the knowledge up front that this measure is so immensely intricate and complicated that it's in all likelihood not something where I'm going to be able to give you every gritty detail, but I'll do my best. So like Prop II, this is a measure that was put on the ballot by the state legislature. And it also has a question that was written by the legislature. In this case, that question reads like this. Again, I'm not going to read this at length. I will be providing my slides, and you should be able to find this one pretty easy on your ballot because there are so few measures on the ballot this year. But before I dive into exactly what HH does, I want to back up and talk a little bit about how property taxes work in Colorado. So the most important discussion is how we get from the value of your home or your business property to the amount of tax that you owe. And it's a little bit different from something like an income tax, where it's your income time a tax rate equals the tax that you owe, or a sales tax, where it's the amount that you purchase in taxable sales times a tax rate equals the amount that you owe. Property taxes have two rates, and they get applied sequentially. So the first thing that happens is the assessor in your county values your home or your business property or your farm or your mine or whatever it is that you owe and that's subject to taxation. For residential property, which is what I'm going to focus on, although HH also impacts commercial property, the way that they do that is they look at the value of your home based on market conditions. And I'm going to be specific here, market conditions as of June 30th in each even numbered year. So it's every 2 years that they do these revaluations. This year, 2023, you paid taxes for 2022 property tax year. So you have not paid your 2023 taxes yet. You've only paid your 2022 taxes. And your 2022 taxes were based on your home's value as of June 30th, 2020. Earlier this year, if you own a home, you also got a notice from your assessor that told you how much your assessor valued your home at for the 2023 tax year. Remember, you have not paid those taxes yet. Those are the taxes that you will pay next year in 2024. But rather than being valued based on market conditions as of June 30th of 2020, your 2023 taxes depend on your home's value as of June 30th of 2022. So to say that again, the taxes you paid this year were based on your home's value in 2020. The taxes for this year, which you will pay next year, are based on your home's value as of June 30th of 2022. And so for many folks, there were big changes in those actual values between June of 2020, which was COVID, when lots of homes weren't being sold because people were, I think, because of concerns about the coronavirus, not even going out to tour homes or not putting their homes on the market. And as a result, home values were slightly depressed even. And June 30th of 2022, when we're out of the pandemic, the housing market's going bananas. In fact, that's probably the peak in home values, and they've even come down a little bit based on the market since then. So we're talking about sort of a trough level to peak level. Those are the levels of values that are being used to set the taxes for this year that you will pay next year. But that's just part of the story. Because like I said, there are these two tax rates that apply. The first of these are assessment rates. These are set by the state, and they apply at the same level for all property that are in a specific class. This is pretty detailed, and I'm not going to drill down into all of the details, but in general, there's a rate for residential property, and there's a rate for non-residential property. These rates actually are now bouncing around a little bit from year to year in response to legislative action, but in general, the residential rate is a lot smaller than the non-residential rate. So if your home is worth, $500,000, the taxable portion of your home is only about $35,000, about 7% of your home's actual value. If you instead had a $500,000 business, you would be paying tax on 29% of that business's actual value. So actual values times the assessment rate gets you to assessed values. And then assessed values are multiplied by mill levies to get to the amount of tax that you owe. So again, two multipliers here. The mill levies are set by local governments. The state does not set these. The state cannot set these. These are a function of local action, which means that if you tell me I live in Colorado and my home is worth $500,000, I don't know how much you pay in taxes on that home, because even though I know the assessment rate, I don't know what your local governments have done in terms of setting their mill levy. Now, to give you a little bit more background here, these assessment rates, the non-residential rate and the residential rate, used to be determined by a constitutional provision called the Gallagher Amendment. The Gallagher Amendment locked the non-residential rate at 29% in the Constitution. So if you read the Colorado Constitution, Article 10, Section 3 actually said non-residential property is assessed at a rate of 29%, period. And then residential property is assessed at whatever rate it has to be to maintain a constant percentage of what statewide residential properties make up for assessed values and what statewide non-residential properties make up for assessed values. This was really complicated and difficult to explain to folks, but the result was that this residential assessment rate got pushed down over time because residential values in the market were growing faster than non-residential values. And so that assessment rate, which started at about 20%, gets pushed down and down and down and down and down till it gets to this 7.15% rate. In 2020, voters in Colorado at the same election where they passed Proposition E also voted to repeal the Gallagher Amendment. So the Gallagher Amendment is no longer in the Constitution. And now these assessment rates are something that the legislature can set on its own without needing to amend the Constitution. Tabor still applies, so they can't raise the rates on their own, but they can lower them. And they've actually taken actions to do that. In 2021, they passed a bill that messed with these assessment rates and brought them down. In 2022, they did the same thing. In 2023, they're referring Prop HH to the ballot. And it does several things, many of them having to do with property taxes. And I think when I get to those items, having this background is going to be pretty important. So here's what Prop HH does. The first thing is that it lowers property taxes owed for homes and businesses. And then note here, I wrote compared to what would be owed under current law. So importantly here, for almost everybody, your taxes are going to go way up between this year and next year if Prop HH fails, and they're still going to go up from this year to next year if Prop HH passes. It's a reduction relative to what you would pay next year without Prop HH, but it's not a reduction relative to what you paid this year. There's also an additional benefit for seniors that begins in 2025. I'll discuss that in a little more detail later. HH also allows the state to retain money that would otherwise be refunded to taxpayers under Tabor through at least the 2032 year, and I'll talk about that in a lot more detail. For only this year, it distributes Tabor refunds to taxpayers in equal amounts instead of giving taxpayers more money back if they had higher incomes. And it creates a new property tax revenue limit that applies to some local governments. HH is a 10-year program, so by default it runs through 2032 if it's approved by voters, but it also authorizes the state legislature to extend its changes indefinitely without further voter approval. So the way that this works is, as you'll see, and you probably have already seen at least some of the advertising around this, but HH has these property tax provisions that lower taxes and has these Tabor provisions that increase the Tabor limit. The state needs voter approval to make that change to the Tabor limit. And so HH says, we're making that change for 10 years, but also included in this authorization is the allowance for the legislature to make that change for further years into the future, so long as it also extends the property tax cuts. So the legislature would have a choice 10 years down the line. Do you want to both extend the property tax cuts and extend the changes to the Tabor limit? They would not be allowed to extend the changes to the Tabor limit without also extending the property tax cuts. So let's get into how this affects property taxes. The first thing that HH does is it tells county assessors, hey, when you're determining the value of a home, before you apply the assessment rate, subtract $40,000 from that value. So if your home was worth $500,000, the assessor would look at that and say, okay, I believe that based on market conditions, your home is worth $500,000. So I'm going to tax it as if it was worth $460,000 after applying this $40,000 reduction. Now, seniors already get a reduction that's like this, provided that they've lived in their home for at least 10 years. The issue is, under current law, if a senior has lived in their home for 10 years, qualified for what's called the senior homestead exemption, which is this $100,000 reduction, and then they need to move, for example, if their home is too big, if they have trouble using the stairs, whatever it is, then upon moving, they lose that benefit. That's the current law. What this would also do is say in 2025, seniors can take that benefit with them when they move. So the $140,000 subtraction is equal to the $100,000 that they get now, plus the $40,000 that they'd get under the measure, but it's something that they'd be able to take with them while moving, which isn't currently an option that's available to them. The second thing that HH does is it reduces assessment rates. Now, one thing that's tricky in publishing a nonpartisan document about HH is, under current law, the assessment rates are different in different years. I was talking about how the legislature made changes to property tax assessment rates in 2021 legislation and 2022 legislation. So actually, next year, the assessment rate is not 7.15, it's 6.765. But going forward, beginning in 2025, the rate is scheduled to pop back up to 7.15% under current law, and HH drops it to 6.7% for residential. Likewise, the non-residential rate would drop from 29% to 27.85. So we've both reduced the valuation of the property and we've reduced the assessment rate. Those are the first two steps in that formula to calculate property taxes that I showed you before. The third thing that it does is, to some extent, it tells local governments that they need to also reduce mill levies, the third step in that equation, to satisfy a property tax revenue limit that it imposes on them. Now, this doesn't apply to all local governments, and for the local governments that it does apply for, it even gives them an opportunity to opt out. So I'll show you that a little bit more later. But that's the third big change it makes to property taxes. So that's a lot of numbers, but it's not something that's really accessible to most voters or most readers. And so what we did in the Blue Book is we looked at different levels that your home might be valued at and tried to give you a sense of how much your taxes would change as a result of Prop HH. And again, the answer is, we really don't know the answer to that question because it's going to depend on where your home is and what local governments in your area have done with respect to mill levies. It also is going to be a function of whether local governments in your area follow that local government revenue limit that I mentioned before. And so what we did is we published these ranges. So you can see for a $500,000 home, we show that in 2023, you'll get a benefit somewhere between $186 and $276. In 2024, your benefit's going to be bigger because under current law, you'd be paying higher taxes. So you'll save somewhere between $314 and $396. You can see if you have a more valuable home, you get a bigger tax cut. And if you have a commercial property, you receive an even larger benefit because commercial properties pay so much more in taxes than homes do, even if they have the same value. We'll get into how this might affect you specifically more on a later slide. So to give you a sense of how this looks in the aggregate, I know this probably won't resonate with everyone here, but just taking into account the assessed value changes, so just the reduction in valuations and the assessment rates, and not counting the local government revenue limit, we expect that under current law, assessed values statewide will go up by 29% in 2023. With Prop HH, they'd only go up by 25.2%. Still a big increase, but not as big of an increase as we'd expect under current law. And those slower rates of growth continue. So in 2024, we'd only see an increase of assessed values by 2.3% as opposed to 6.3%, and in 2025 by 3.5% as opposed to 4.2%. That local government revenue limit piece is something that I think is an important part of Proposition HH, but it's been difficult for us to produce estimates for because it's really a function of local government decision making. So this impacts the mill levies part of how property taxes are calculated. Remember, I told you the state controls assessment rates. That's everything we've talked about up to this point. Local governments control mill levies. Now, in Colorado, there are different types of local governments. There are governments called home rule local governments. And those are governments where the citizens of the city, they're usually municipal governments, have passed a ballot measure that says we want to organize under something called a home rule charter. And as a result, we don't want the state to be able to tell us what to do. And if a local government has enacted a home rule charter, the state can't tell them to do anything with their mill levies. If they haven't, though, the state actually can. Other districts are subordinate to the state. So if they're counties or statutory municipalities, which are these districts that are not home rule cities, or if they're special districts, the state can pass laws that make requirements of them. And so the local government revenue limit applies to counties, statutory municipalities, and special districts. No, it does not apply to school districts. The state could have enforced this requirement on school districts and chose not to do that. It limits their property tax revenue to the amount collected in the prior year plus inflation. So this is a pretty strict cap because I just told you assessed values are going up by still 25.2%, even with Proposition HH. But the inflation adjustment that we have is only 8%. So instead of taxes being able to go up by 25.2%, local governments would need to cut their mill levies so that they only go up by 8%. Now, HH includes an opt-out. Local governments can make a vote of their city council or their board of county commissioners or their board of directors, whomever the legislative body is for the local government, and waive the limit so that it doesn't apply to them. But they can only do that after they send a notice that they are conducting a public hearing, and then they receive public testimony, take the public testimony into consideration, and then vote to either weaken the limit or waive the limit. If they don't take that action, they must reduce their mill levies or refund any revenue above that limit to taxpayers. So that's the property tax components of HH. If you're still with me, I'm going to move on to talk about the Tabor components of Prop HH. So I know that some of you already heard Dr. Ramey's presentation. I'm not going to give you a full Tabor primer here, that's too much information, but I'm going to revisit the part that impacts Prop HH. So Tabor limits the amount of money that the state can retain and spend each year, and that limit currently grows by population growth plus inflation. Revenue collected above the limit has to be refunded to taxpayers. And Prop HH would create a new, higher limit which allows the state to retain and spend more money. And because the state is retaining and spending more, it would also reduce Tabor refunds. That new limit would be grown by population growth plus inflation, plus an additional 1 percentage point each year. So, for example, this year we expect inflation to be 4.9%, and we expect population growth to be 1%. So under current law, the Tabor limit could grow by 5.9%, 4.9 plus 1. If Prop HH passes, the Tabor limit could grow by 4.9 plus 1 plus 1, 6.9%. And that 1 percentage point would stack annually beyond that. So to visualize this, the current Tabor limit is called the referendum C cap. It's higher than the Tabor limit was when it was set back in 1992 because of a measure that voters approved in 2005. Proposition HH would stack on top of that referendum C cap and allow the state to retain more money. And that more money would be small initially. In the first year, we expect it to be $167 million. In the second year, we expect it to be $370 million, and it would continue becoming cumulatively larger over time. In fiscal year 2031-32, which is the end of that first 10-year version of the program, we expect that Prop HH would allow the state to retain $2.2 billion above the current level of the referendum C cap. Now, HH specifies how the state is required to use this money. The first requirement is that up to 20% of the amount retained is required to be used to reimburse local governments for their lost property tax revenue. The second thing is a program to provide rental assistance. You've noticed that everything in this so far is about property taxes, property taxes, property taxes. If you're somebody who rents your home, you don't directly pay property taxes. Your landlord may pass them through to you. The state wanted to provide some amount of money for rental assistance, and so they set aside this $20 million. This is a very small portion of the revenue retention. Everything that's left over would be used to reimburse school districts for their lost property tax revenue, and beyond that, to be deposited in a state fund that's used to fund K-12 education. And over 10 years, and if the program's extended beyond that, this is going to be the significant majority of the money that's retained from Tabor refunds. Let's talk a little bit more about how it affects Tabor refunds. So I told you back here, this is the amount that the state can retain, and that's money that the state would be retaining against what would otherwise be refunded. But there's this one other provision that says in 2023, if Prop HH passes, refunds are going to be flattened out. It's only for 1 year. And we estimate in the Blue Book that the amount that would be refunded to each single taxpayer would be $898, or about $1,800 in the case of a joint filer. So $900 for a single filer, $1,800 for a joint filer. If we were publishing the Blue Book today, we'd actually revise these numbers down a little bit to more like $840 for a single filer, and $1,680 for a joint filer, just based on some new information that wasn't available at the time when we published the Blue Book, but still in the same ballpark. Now, this is a change relative to the way that we currently pay Tabor refunds, which is distributed according to folks' incomes. So lower income taxpayers get less under current law, and higher income taxpayers get more. Under Prop HH, everybody would get the same amount, which means folks on the low end of the income distribution, about 62% of taxpayers would get more Tabor refunds. And folks at the higher end of the income distribution, everybody with more than $99,000 in income would get lower Tabor refunds. And you can see those impacts are pretty different depending on where your income falls within that distribution. Now, beyond 2023, there isn't this redistributive impact. Prop HH only flattens Tabor refunds for that first year. So for later years, we'd retain the 6-tier structure, and we'd make reductions in the amount to be refunded because the state would be retaining more revenue. You can see in 2024, that's a relatively small impact, but it gets bigger in 2025, and it would get bigger in years beyond that if we're still making Tabor refunds that far into the future. There's been some discussion about, does Prop HH eliminate Tabor refunds? And I'm going to get into that in the next couple of slides. But I'm very confident that in 2024 and 2025, Prop HH does not eliminate Tabor refunds in those years. At most, it makes those refunds smaller than they would be under current law. But that may be a pretty significant impact on your budget, depending on where your income falls in these distributions. And it gets bigger over time. So how does HH impact Tabor refunds? Well, over the long run, it's going to depend a lot on how much revenue the state collects. And we don't actually know that yet because the economy can have pretty significant impacts on revenue collections over a long period of time. So I told you that in fiscal 31-32, HH allows the state to retain and spend up to $2.2 billion more than Ref C does, than the current law Tabor limit does. But how much we actually retain and spend is going to be a function of revenue in that year. So let's say there's a recession, revenue doesn't perform very well, and revenue actually falls below the referendum C cap in that year. That could happen. In that instance, HH doesn't do anything with Tabor refunds because it actually doesn't let the state keep any money. All of the money that the state would collect would fall under the referendum C cap under current law, and HH doesn't have any impact on Tabor refunds. Say the economy performs at a more normal pace, it's above the referendum C cap, but it doesn't quite reach that Proposition HH cap. Well, in that case, the state would retain all of the revenue over the Ref C cap because everything's still below that HH cap. And there would be no Tabor refund in that year because HH would eliminate it. It would allow the state to retain and spend all of that money. In a third scenario, let's say the economy performs quite well. Revenue exceeds the Proposition HH cap in 31-32. Well, in that case, we still would be paying Tabor refunds, but they'd be reduced by $2.2 billion relative to what the state would be required to refund under current law, because there'd be that $2.2 billion retention between the dashed gray line here and the blue line that represents the HH cap. We're winding down here. I want to tell you about how HH affects local governments, because of course, in Colorado, property taxes are not collected by the state. I told you before the state sets those assessment rates, and Prop HH is a state ballot measure, but the state doesn't get any revenue from property taxes. All property taxes go to counties, cities, school districts, and special districts. And so they're the folks that are directly impacted by the reduction in property taxes. So first of all, HH would impose this local limit for many local governments, provided that they don't opt out. We talked about that before. Second, the state would be required to pay back reimbursements to local governments for some of their property tax revenue that's lost. The amount that they'd get reimbursed is going to depend on a bunch of circumstances, but it ranges from 65% to 100%. However, and I think this is what local governments would tell you is the most important element, there's also a provision in HH that says once your assessed values in your local area have grown by enough, what the state perceives to be enough, so 20% relative to last year's assessment, then you no longer get any money back from the state. At that point, the state says, look, even with Prop HH, even with the assessment rate cuts that we handed down to you, you still saw 20% increases in your assessed values. There's no longer a need for the state to backfill you at that point. Now, your mileage may vary in terms of whether you perceive that to be a correct policy decision, but the result of that is the local government backfill actually gets smaller over time because more of those local governments exceed that eligibility threshold and don't get that money back. Now, school districts are treated differently. School districts are reimbursed through the school finance formula, which is a formula in state law. Any amount of property tax loss that affects schools has to be reimbursed by the state for their total program funding. If any of you work in school finance, you'll know that that's not the whole picture. There's also something called mill levy override revenue, and that's not reimbursed by the state. So that's an area where, depending on how that mill levy override is structured, a school district could see a revenue loss from Prop HH. I told you the rabbit hole is very deep. I've gone somewhat deep here, but I'm not diving all the way to the bottom because of time constraints. Very last slide that I have for you all this evening, and that's that this is a difficult topic to nail down for what impacts you specifically. We knew that this is going to depend on how much your home is worth, whether you own a home, where you live, and how much money you make. And so what we did is we built this tool there's a QR code here. There's also a link that you can use to populate some parameters about your own circumstances and help you find out how the measure might be most likely to affect you for the next couple of years. Your property tax savings depends on the value of your property, whether it's a residential or non-residential property, and where it's located. Your Tabor refunds, again, in 2023, there's this flat refund. It's an increase for low and middle income people and a decrease for high income people. And starting in 2024, you'd see reduced Tabor refunds that apply in every subsequent year. I know that was a lot of information to digest. I want to thank you all for sticking with me. This is my contact information, and if there are questions that arise after the meeting tonight, you are always welcome to contact me, and either I or somebody on my staff will get back to you. But at this point, Ali, I'm ready to take questions from our audience this evening.
Wonderful. And thank you so much, Greg, for walking us through what is clearly a very intricate situation. And so one of the first questions that we had from the audience in person was asking about how the 40,000, 100,000, and then rate reduction, how are those rates determined?
So I think the question is asking, how did the numbers that are in Prop HH end up in Prop HH?
Exactly.
I don't have the full backstory on that. I'll tell you that the basic outline of this is built on the bill they passed last year, which was Senate Bill 22-238. That bill also had valuation reductions, and it also had assessment rate reductions. And at that time, that was like very publicly, I'm not talking out of school here because this was widely reported in the press, a negotiation between the governor's office and a business group called Colorado Concern that was devised around avoiding what the governor's office perceived to be a potentially hazardous ballot measure that could have been on the ballot last year. So that's where 238 came from. Again, I'm only relaying the information that I know is publicly available. As a nonpartisan staff person, I can't disclose about anything else that I know about behind the scenes stuff. In terms of this year, I think that the changes in HH sort of built on what was already there infrastructurally in 238, but how they like arrived at those actual numbers, I don't know.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any others yet, but except for them coming in the chat box.
Okay. So Katie has a question that says, looking at the tool, when it states property tax with Prop HH, that would be if the measure passes. I'm going to actually screen share the tool really quick so those of you who haven't pulled it up can see what she's asking about here. Okay, so you should now be able to see the tool. This is a new product for our office. I'm actually really proud of it. I think that it's a pretty amazing leap forward in terms of the service that we're able to provide to folks. What I'll tell you here is if you populate, the circumstances here, you can see the crazy examples that I had to pick when testing this. But let's say that you have a home with a more typical value. This is probably, oh, that's income. That's a lot of money that somebody could probably make. Just gonna choose a few parameters here. So what you're seeing here is, here's your change in your Tabor refunds with Prop HH. For this person, those refunds are going down because they're a higher income individual. Here's your refunds next year with Prop HH. Again, they're going down. And here's the impacts on your property taxes, and they're also going down. And for this individual, they're actually going down by more than their Tabor refunds are going down. So this person ends up ahead. I think Katie's point may have been, oh, wow, these numbers look really big to me. And I want to provide a little bit of additional detail on what you're seeing here. This is going to get into a little bit of gritty weeds. There are mill levies that are assessed by local governments that we do not expect to be affected by Proposition HH. Denver is a very good example of this. So for those of you who live in Denver, if your home's value went up by 40%, the taxes that you need to pay to the city and county of Denver are not going to go up by 40%, regardless of what happens with Prop HH. The reason for that is because the city and county of Denver has a limit on how much revenue it's allowed to collect from property taxes. That already applies under current law. It's not the HH local government revenue limit. It's something that Denver voters approved back in 2014. So for Denver, we know there are a certain number of mills that are actually, the mills are going to become smaller next year because if they were at their current level, they would collect too much money and Denver wouldn't be able to keep that money. So the back end of this tool essentially subtracts the Denver mills when calculating this line, the difference. And I think that it should. I think that that's a correct thing for the tool to be doing because we don't expect HH to result in any savings for those mills. We expect those mills to fall under both current law and HH to allow Denver to collect its maximum allowable amount of revenue. Now, if you live in Denver, you're still seeing a property tax savings from HH related to the mills that you pay to Denver Public Schools, related to the mills that you pay for override mills on your Denver Public Schools levy, related to some special districts that you might belong to. And so there is a difference. And what we had originally done is just used the mills that we knew were going to be affected and shown those in the tool. And we said, great, here's what you're going to pay for those mills under current law. Here's what you're going to pay under Prop HH. Here's that difference. Ship it. And then somebody smart on my team was like, Greg, we're artificially drastically understating what people are going to pay in property taxes because we're not counting all of their mills. We're only counting the mills that HH affects. And so that person made the point that it would be a more credible representation for us to go back and count the city and county of Denver mills, even though we know those are going to fall. That's a lot of explanation. I'm guessing all of you did not follow it. The reason I wanted to provide it is I think that all of these numbers, the ones that you see under current law and HH for 2023 and the same ones for 2024, are too high if you live in Denver. The tool isn't built to estimate these numbers accurately. The tool is built to estimate the difference accurately, and I would defend the tool as the best representation of that difference. I'm pretty confident that this is the right way to do it, given the information that we have, but I have gotten questions like Katie's, like, hey, whoa, that looks really high to me. Lydia asked a question. She said, will the $20 million reserved for rental assistance if Prop HH passes be allocated to renters directly via state refund or to existing housing programs? This goes to something called the housing development. No, that's not right. It goes to a fund that makes grants to renters, but it is not a refund. And as you probably know, $20 million divided by all of the renters in the state is a very small amount of money. So presumably some renters are going to get more of this money and most renters are going to get none of this money pursuant to downstream decisions that have yet to be made by the State Division of Housing.
We had a question from the folks in person that I think kind of goes to the point that you were making about local mills and kind of how all these pieces fit together. And the question was that Tabor feels like a separate question from this property tax changes. And so wanting to kind of understand why these are bucketed together in one proposition.
Sure, absolutely. I think I'm still sharing the tool, which is fine. I'll leave that on screen for now, and then I'll go back to the slideshow if I need to. What the question was about why these two things are together. I think what the proponents would tell you is, and actually they have said this very publicly, they perceive cutting property taxes to be an important thing for the state to do. When they cut property taxes, they recognize that they are going to be not cutting state revenue, but rather cutting local revenues. And in particular, cutting school district revenues. And so they perceive the increase in the state Tabor limit to be able to provide a financing mechanism to pay back local governments that are especially hurt by those cuts. We've focused a lot on urban areas tonight, and I think we should given the audience, but there are areas of the state where the cuts in Prop HH will cause their property taxes to result in negative growth year over year. If you're in Southern Colorado, that $40,000 subtraction in some rural areas is like actually going to be a pretty significant tax cut such that people pay less taxes next year than they do this year. So retaining the additional revenue lets the state backfill local governments for their lost revenue and also lets the state put together more money for public schools. As an objective observer, and I really do perceive myself to be that way, I'm in the know, like I work in the building, but I also have talked to folks on the pro side and the con side like at length about this forever now. I think it's fair to say the amount that the state will retain under Tabor is likely to be greater than what it needs to retain to backfill these losses. But the additional money that's retained is put into the state education fund and creates a long-term source of funding for public schools, which may also appeal to you as a voter. So I think that's the question you're being asked to consider. The nexus between the two things is this backfill idea, but you're right, you could run those as two separate questions as opposed to putting them in one issue. And opponents have noted the legislature could do all of the property tax stuff in this measure on its own. The only reason that they have to refer it to voters is because of the Tabor retention piece. I see a few more questions in the chat. Ali, do you want me to take those or are there more questions in the room first?
Can I pose a quick follow-up to what you had just?
Yeah, of course.
So I know you'd mentioned as you were going through that the fact that this kind of can keep compounding, right? These additional, like the increased ceiling on Tabor, the additional funds from that continues to grow over time, right? And so wondering whether there's kind of similar effects if taxpayers should be thinking about it from that perspective on their end as well, or is it really that they should be kind of that it's not really happening for consumers? I don't know that was well posed, but I do go where I'm going.
No, it's a great question. The amount by which HH eats into Tabor refunds becomes larger over time. So just like the cap becomes like the difference between the Ref C cap and the Prop HH cap becomes bigger. As it becomes bigger, the amount by which HH reduces Tabor refunds become bigger, provided that there's enough money to have Tabor refunds at all. And so households should perceive this as becoming a larger drain on their Tabor refunds over time.
Thanks, that's helpful. Okay, I think that is all we've got from the room right now, so we want to switch to the chats.
Okay, I closed the share. Sorry about that. I wanted
okay.
to find the chat.
There was one question about specifically related to the calculator. Folks wondering if they should use AGI or gross income.
Oh, great question. So AGI, what you actually, if you love tax accounting, what you should use is something called modified AGI for Tabor, which you can find on your state return. For the vast majority of taxpayers who don't have complicated tax situations, that's going to be the same as their AGI. AGI, if you don't know it, is adjusted gross income. I see a question from Allison. What is the impetus of this bill? Why was it initially put forward? I'll share what I think is publicly available, and I don't have a whole lot of insight beyond that, despite being pretty in the weeds on this. The state, again, doesn't collect property taxes, but the state did initiate the process to repeal the Gallagher Amendment. The reason that taxes are going up by so much is largely a result of the Gallagher Amendment no longer being in place. Had Gallagher still been in the Constitution, assessment rates would just be getting pushed down by a lot next year, such that instead of paying taxes on an assessment rate of 7.15%, taxpayers would see lower and lower and lower assessment rates. The state drove the fight to repeal Gallagher. That was, again, a state referred measure in 2020. And post Gallagher being in place, these rates of tax increase are an issue for which some state policymakers perceive there to be state responsibility. And then again, okay, you're putting forward a measure to cut property taxes, that affects local government revenues, backfill, Tabor retention, everything that I said earlier about that. I've gotten a bunch of great new questions. Ali, feel free to cut me off when we need to move on to the next part of the program, but I'd like to take these because I think they're pretty great. Yeah,
if we want to maybe take about 2-3 more minutes more, so probably take 1 or 2 of those questions and then hop over to Elsa.
Okay. I'm going to share again because I know some of these questions concern the slideshow. Okay, and now I've lost the chat, as is my want. Here we go. All right, there is a question from Nicole. Who is meant to benefit from this bill? It seems property owners will benefit to a certain extent, but non-property owners will not benefit as they will experience lower Tabor refunds. Who is meant to benefit is a question I, as the Blue Book author, don't really want to answer because I think that's a question for the people who put it forward. I would say who does benefit and who doesn't benefit. People who benefit the most are low-income homeowners. So imagine a senior with a low fixed income who's owned their home and their home's value has gone up by a ton and they owe all of this money in property taxes and they want to move, but they're worried about losing their senior homestead exemption. That's the archetype that benefits the most, is a low-income owner of property. The person who sees the greatest loss is a high-income renter, somebody who makes high six-figure salary, sees a huge reduction in their Tabor refunds, is renting an apartment downtown. That person doesn't receive any property tax benefit because they're not paying property taxes, and they see a big hit to their Tabor refunds because their income is so high. And then everybody in the middle, so if you imagine like a high-income homeowner or a low-income renter, finds themselves somewhere in the middle. That low-income renter doesn't get a property tax benefit, but they do benefit from that flattening of Tabor refunds in year one, and that might be a bigger benefit to them than the slightly lower Tabor refunds that they see in the following years because it's hundreds of dollars as opposed to dozens of dollars. Channing asked, on that graph, is the Tabor base what would have been without Prop CC? Yes, except it's not Prop CC, it's Referendum C. And the only reason I'm being pedantic about that is because those two things are actually very similar things that came at different times, and one of which passed and one of which failed. So Ref C is the measure from 2005 that passed. The Tabor limit base is what the limit would have been without Ref C. Prop CC is a measure from 2019 that was referred by the legislature and that did not pass, and so that one failed. And then Paige asked, there's a part of Prop HH, I believe, that says if Proposition HH passes, it can be extended indefinitely without voter input if the government decides to extend. If Proposition HH passes and it proves poor for the voters, how can we have a future say in adjusting Tabor and property taxes? I think through communicating with your legislators and elections, right? Like, I think if HH passes and you as a voter perceive it to have negative impacts, then the way to stop it from being extended is to be very vocal in telling your legislator, hey, I think that this is bad and you shouldn't extend it. Remember, this is up for extension in 2032. Pretty much nobody who's in the legislature today is going to be here in 2032. These are all going to be new people. And they're, I assume, not going to be wedded to extending this policy if it's like wildly unpopular among their constituents.
Thank you so much, Greg. I think we're going to call it there. Thank you for all of your insight, for fielding all of our many questions, and for your willingness to share your information so that folks can reach out afterward on your slides so that we can do our own deep diving.
You all are always an incredibly attentive and an interesting audience to present to. You ask fantastic questions. I'm honored to be here, and I hope the rest of your program goes well. I'm going to enjoy my wine and listen in a little more, and then I'll hop off.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And with that, we will move on to our second panelist of the evening. We're going to discuss Denver's Question 2P with Elsa O'Guin. She is the president and CEO of the Denver Preschool Program and oversees all organization activities, and in partnership with their board of directors, provides direction and leadership toward the achievement of DPP's overall mission, vision, and strategic plan. Elsa grew up in a small town in Chihuahua, Mexico, and immigrated to the United States with her family when she was 17. She learned English while attending high school and college in Denver, where she worked as an intern in the nonprofit sector. That internship eventually led her to the Women's Foundation of Colorado, and then to Rose Community Foundation, where she served as the senior program officer for child and family development for 21 years. Elsa is a social entrepreneur and started the Business Center for Women at Mi Casa and the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado. She's one of the founders of Early Milestones Colorado, the Denver Opportunity Youth Initiative, Colorado's Office of Early Childhood, Borealis Philanthropy, and the Skills to Compete Coalition. A former member and co-chair of the Early Childhood Leadership Commission, Elsa currently serves on the board of Tools of the Mind and chairs the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado board. Also, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to do a quick transition over to your slide deck, but I will hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to present to the Junior League. I know that you have been long-term supporters of early childhood and have had the opportunity to connect with you over the years. And so I feel like I'm coming to home to some family, an organization that has been supporting early childhood for many, many years. And it's wonderful to be here. So I will tell you about Ballot Initiative 2P, which is in Denver. It's a Denver ballot initiative. First, I will tell you that I am here on my volunteer capacity. I am actually volunteering my time to be working on the campaign for the Denver Preschool Program. We are a 501c3 organization, but because we are primarily funded with monies from the city of Denver, I cannot use any of those funds for C4 activities, which this is C4 activities. So the timing couldn't be better because it's in the evening and it's after I'm done with my other job and I can come and do this work right now. So thank you for the opportunity. First, I will tell you that the Denver Preschool Program has been, it's currently authorized until 2026. Our first authorization was in 2006. We were reauthorized in 2014, a couple years early. Our ballot said that we have a sunset provision of 10 years and we had to go to the ballot every 10 years. So we're currently authorized until 2026. But looking at planning for the next couple of years, we decided to do some polling. Starting last winter, finalized it earlier this year. And what we learned is that we had very, very strong polling support when we were talking to bipartisan likely voters in Denver. Our numbers were at 78% of very likely or very strong support, because we always look at strong and not just the likely support. We knew that our strong support is at 58%, which tell us that we had a good opportunity for us to go to the ballot this year. We were referred to the ballot by Denver City Council, and we had a great, we have a great partnership with the current city council and the previous city council. And so we had the opportunity to do that referral with 100% support. We also knew that in 2023, the ballot initiative was going to be a lot less crowded than if we waited until 2024, which also meant it was going to be less expensive. And if by some reason, because anything can happen from now until election time, if we have a shocking defeat, we have the opportunity to regroup and go back before the sunset happens until 2026. The actual ballot question says that without raising additional taxes, shall the existing voter approved 15/100% sales and use tax dedicated to funding the Denver Preschool Program, which is set to expire in December 31, 2026, be permanently extended until such authority is altered or repealed by the Denver City Council or Denver voters. This is 15 cents on every $100 is what our tax ends up being for the citizens of Denver. I'll go to the next. Election day is November the 7th. The ballots are in the mail already, and it is a relatively empty ballot. There are a couple of school board races, some of you get to select. There are two statewide questions. You all heard about Prop HH and Prop II. Were a lot easier to understand than HH, but very, very important questions, both of them. So we're in good company. And we are the only issue on the Denver ballot, the only question that is as an issue coming to the campaign. We have a modest campaign budget, and we have been successfully secured the funding that we need for the campaign this year. And at this point, we're primarily asking people to vote yes on 2P. We have website, we have yard signs, some digital advertising and personal outreach that we are doing right now. And then I'll tell you why. Let me go to the next one. So this is what we know. This is not a tax increase. It is a continuation of an existing tax at the current rate. So it is not a new tax. It's not going to cost additional funds to the citizens of Denver. And we want to remind you that DPP, the Denver Preschool Program, has a 17-year track record of success. We have served more than 65,000 Denver students. And just as an example, in 2023, we provided 18.3 million in tuition credits. That is, that provided the opportunity for us to serve 4,700 4-year-olds, which is about 60% of all the 4-year-olds in Denver. And we have had the opportunity to do it with quality providers. And as a whole, we have been growing over the years the number of providers that we help, and have currently 270 quality providers. So we fund providers that are at Denver Public Schools, that are public schools, nonprofit providers, for-profit providers, religiously affiliated providers, and home-based providers, large and small. We really believe in family choice, so we expand all the choice opportunities that we can have for the families. Our funding, also, in addition to providing quality, we expanded the capacity, and we were essential for the work that happened during the COVID pandemic, because we were able to continue to fund providers to ensure that they were open and serving the children of Denver. We know that preschool works, and we know that we deliver very strong results. We have 3 evaluations that are part of the Denver Preschool Program. One is our process evaluation, just to continually enhance what we do. A short-term evaluation that we measure what kids are before they start with us and when they finish the 1 year in the program. And then we have an evaluation that follows all our kids, and have our first cohort of children that are now attending college. We have, so we know what our results are because we have the evaluation available. The reason that preschool funding is needed in Denver is because we know that preschool is very, very expensive, and that the majority of the cost of preschool is paid by parents. The majority of parents do not qualify for other programs which are only based on financial aid. We are a universal program, so we fund all the families. But what we know is that in Denver, the average cost of care is about $12,000 per year. We know that 55% of the Denver preschool families are facing economic hardships, particularly when they are dealing with high cost of funding of housing in Denver. We have been endorsed by the League of Women Voters, the Colorado Children's Campaign, the Women's Foundation, and the list continues to grow of organizations that are supporting us. Next. I should also say, we don't have any opposition. We don't have any opposition. So when you go to the Blue Book, you will find that there is no opposition. We encourage you to vote for us, to endorse us with any communication strategies that you have. Our website is yes on 2P. And if you go to our website, you will get access to communication endorsements, so icons, and the way to endorse our campaign. We do have yard signs available, and we have locations where you can either pick it up at a site that is near your home, or you could offer to be a site that can host and pick up for other friends that may be interested. The graphics and the messages that you could use in social media are also on our website, and we encourage you to email or text your Denver friends and neighbors to support the children of Denver. And I'll catch you up on your time, because I know you were a little bit behind on schedule, because HH is complicated. We're all still learning. And so now I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions that I may answer.
Thank you so much, Elsa. I appreciate that so much. As you know, there was a lot to chat through. Folks, what questions do we have for Elsa? Seeing some coming through, and no, I'm actually getting a notice that there aren't any from the folks in person. Beautifully succinctly described. Anybody in the chat?
If there are no questions, I'm going to take a minute, Ali, to just explain why the Denver preschool program still needs funding when we now have the state universal preschool program. Thank you, Emily. And to just say that the state universal preschool program is paying for 15 hours per week. And what we know is that our families, 89% of our families ask us for full or extended day for preschool, for the preschool programs for their families. So what we know is that in Denver, we need to continue to subsidize what the state is not yet able to pay. And but it does allow us to not only provide preschool for 4-year-olds. This year we have expanded to start serving 3-year-olds. So we, because of the state universal preschool program, we are already funding some 3-year-olds in Denver. So thank you for your support on that one as well.
And thank you for that additional context. I know that there's a not small number of folks in the league who have participated in have had family members participate in the Denver preschool program and other initiatives like it. So we really appreciate your time and spent describing this for us and your work overall in the early childhood space.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I thank you for your support as well.
Thank you so much. And with that, we will hop over to our last speaker of the night. I will not give you full bio because we know her, we love her. Julia Scanlon of Aponte Busan will give us a quick overview of some of the local area ballot initiatives.
Hi team, thanks so much. Allie, 10 out of 10 tonight also. Just wanted to say like straight up huge kudos. Really quickly, just want to give a couple resources and then kind of my big ask for everyone from the night is just no doubt that you have a smaller ballot than hopefully last year, which I know was a rough one. But for anybody who lives in the metro area, you're going to have a couple different things going on. So I will go ahead and share my screen, just a few resources, and then we'll let y'all get on with the rest of your evening. So good news is that hopefully you don't have too much going on in terms of the ballot. Next year, I will say, will be a doozy. So just mentally prepare yourself for that. But good thing to know is that you still have time if your ballot perhaps hasn't come in the mail, or I know one time I got 2 ballots in the mail. If you have any questions about, you know, your political affiliation, if you're registered in the right place, the Secretary of State has a really useful tool that you can just hop on at govotecolorado.gov. And then a quick reminder, if anybody's new to the state in Colorado, there's no registration deadline. So we have same day registration. If you're not ready to vote yet, you can go all up until November 7th and get registered. So feel free to go find your local polling center if you need to. And then just a quick reminder for folks who might still have their ballots in hand, since we do mail out most of ours, you need to get those in the mail by the 31st is what's recommended. If it's not in the mail by then they suggest you drop it off in person at a voting center. And then for anybody who plans to or likes to vote in person, just know that you just have to be in line by 7 p.m. on election day. So even if it's a busy day and there's a ton of folks, as long as you're in line, you will be able to vote on that day. So I think what I'll do just as kind of a quick thing, we'll stop share. Basically, if you live anywhere in the Adams, Arapahoe, Jeffco, Boulder, any of these folks, if you're anywhere in the metro area, even Denver with our, you know, couple questions, you more than likely have either school board races going on, municipal or county ballot measures, and then some folks also have a couple like oddities like college district offices. You might have something going on with your local fire districts, you know, so I would highly encourage folks to use your local governments put out their own types of blue books, just like the state, that have nonpartisan information. There's a lot of good resources to be had there, but the big things for the off year is just to fill out your full ballot, even if you're a little confused. There's a lot of good resources out there from nonpartisan folks. And then one interesting thing, if anybody's in the Boulder area voting in the city of Boulder, they are running their first ranked choice mayoral vote. So just kind of curious to keep an eye on that, because folks are saying that might become a model for other parts of the state. So just thought that might be of interest. But if folks need anything in terms of looking up anything for municipal officials, school board folks, please feel free to reach out to the Public Policy Council. They can get you connected with myself. I'll put my email in the chat. Happy to pass along some specific resources, but I know we're over time. So I just want to say thank you for taking the time to care about your civic engagement. It's super important. And if you need help with any resources, we're happy to be helpful. I think that's all for me.
Okay, thank you so much. Anybody have any immediate questions for Julia that you want to pose to her while we've got her? Not seeing any from the in-person folks yet either. Okay, none from the in-person folks. So I think we are good. And like you said, like she said, you've got her, she'll share her contact information. And we're so appreciative of your great knowledge and willingness to share it with us.
Anytime.
Dedication to keeping us on time. All in all.
I love it.
Okay. In that case, I will move us into our closeout time. So as a reminder, Julia said it just now, I will say it again. Please remember to vote. Please make sure that you are registered to vote. If you are not certain, double check, figure it out, get set up on election day, whatever you need to do to make sure that you get the opportunity to vote on all of these initiatives that you've learned so much about this evening. Thank you to all of you for joining us for a wine and ballots training. We really hope that this overview of the Colorado statewide ballot measures has helped prepare you to vote. You will be able to check your inbox shortly after tonight's meeting closes out for a link to the recording of this training, additional resources, and for a feedback survey. I will also be putting that feedback survey directly into the chat. So if you want to hop on it before you go, that would be appreciated too. Any Junior League of Denver members, if you have not already, put your name with parentheses JLD into the chat. Would encourage you to do that before you go, just to ensure that we're able to assign credit effectively. And other than that, thank you very much for attending. Please fill out that feedback survey and please remember to vote by November 7th. Thanks so much.